The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is expected to take place in the city of Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, from the 7th to the 18th of November. World leaders, including Kenya, will be participating in this critical meeting. As expected, Kenya will be sending a strong delegation to pitch the case for climate change. This week on Inside Government, we are talking about climate change matters and the COP27. We're joined by the Principal Secretary in the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, Dr. Chris Kipto. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. for joining us. What message is Kenya taking to COP27?
Thank you, Brian. Yes, I want to confirm Kenya will participate in the UNFCCC, the 27th meeting of the United Convention Framework for Climate Change that is taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh. We participated actively in the 26th, what we call COP26, which took place in Glasgow, UK. And this time, we are also going to Sharm el-Sheikh, especially given that it is in Africa.
Yeah.
And we have called this an African COP. Being an African COP, we expect that we will achieve a lot. And in fact, for some of us, we are saying this should be the COP for implementation, not a COP conference of parties for further negotiation. Because for the last 26 years, all the conference from COP1, COP2 up to COP26, we've been negotiating. And we finished the negotiations in Glasgow with the last article under what we call Article 6 that deals with carbon market. Now we want to see implementation, because to say climate change is a distant crisis is to lie. It is actually very much within us. We feel it, we see it. Currently, our country is going through a difficult time. More than 21 counties are under severe drought. You have seen numbers reported of animals we have lost. I saw elephants, buffaloes, wildebeest, zebras, and many other wildlife. And we have lost over 2.5 million animals, livestock. That, you just saw, last week I saw farmers in Kajiado selling dying animals at 500 shillings, and a goat going for 100 shillings. That is really a manifestation of the problem. If I look at it globally, Africa is really bearing the biggest impact of climate change. Africa is only contributing a total of 4% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Yet the impact of that climate change is really being felt most by Africa. Africa has 18% of the world's population. And this population, a lot of them don't even have electricity. You're talking about 600 million people not even on electricity. So when you talk about climate change, to them, and even mitigating it, it's a distant matter to them. I think that is why in this COP, first we are saying we would like to have this conference, COP27, to have recognition of the special needs and special circumstances for Africa. Because Africa now is spending a huge budget on adaptation. We are estimating some countries between 3 to 10% of our budget to try and mitigate and adapt to climate change. So, and yet we are bearing very little impact on this. So we are talking about our priority is to look at special needs and circumstances for Africa, that they should now be seen to be looking at least countries should look at this. Number two, we want to see greater focus on mitigation. And mitigation means taking a high ambition to mitigate, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And who should do it? We are saying those most responsible for climate change must take responsibility. 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions are caused by the G20, the top 20 rich countries in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And these are countries also who control 80% of the world economy in terms of GDP. Because they are responsible for that huge emission, historical emissions, we are saying they need to take more ambition. They have a responsibility to take more ambition to reduce the further greenhouse gas emissions. Because to ask us to reduce our 4%, and yet we haven't even grown as much, it becomes an issue. So that greater responsibility is important. So we are saying focus is mitigation, but mitigation with more focus by developed countries to take a greater responsibility to reduce.
Mm-hmm.
The second one is adaptation. That we need, because we are contributing little to the greenhouse gas emissions, yet we are bearing the greatest impact. We are seeking for further support on adaptation funding. That is for money to help us. We know, of course, we have we have the Global Environmental Facility, we have the what we call GCF, Green Climate Finance, but they are not enough. We have a huge adaptation gap in terms of finance, and we are therefore asking that we need to see more of this. In fact, we are also seeking to see the fulfillment of the pledges that were made a few years ago by the developed countries to support developing countries to ensure that they have at least $100 billion by 2020 every year, so to deal with adaptation. That has not come. So we want to see more on adaptation, more on finance, because we need more of green finance and other finance. We need more money to deal with adaptation and mitigation. And finally, we are also looking at what we are calling loss and damage. We went through a situation where a phenomena we haven't seen in the recent past, where lakes in Rift Valley, including Lake Victoria, rose in a big way. Rising lakes phenomena, where it was mainly caused by climate change. And when we estimated, because that's right, you look at Baringo, Lake Nakuru, Lake Naivasha, Lake Turkana, and other lakes in the Rift Valley, including Lake Victoria, the level of water rose in a big way. Water flooded, and it submerged infrastructure. It submerged animals, it's schools, health centers, and we estimated about 18 billion shillings that we needed just to deal with it. Now, where would we get money as Kenya to deal with something that we are not responsible? That's why we are calling for more attention on loss and damage, because there is loss and damage coming out of climate change when we are not responsible.
You see, when you look at the last 26 meetings, I mean, they have been labeled by many as talk shops where, people meet, they issue big statements, they talk big, but the conversations are not followed by concrete steps. How do we make the first COP in Africa, to have results, to have concrete measures that are going to help the continent and the world to deal with the issues around climate change?
I think this is a matter that we have all discussed and have agreed. That is why from tomorrow we have what we call the Africa Group of Negotiators beginning their work for 2 days to take up African position. And immediately thereafter, on the 4th and 5th, the Africa Group will meet together with the G77 plus China, because we have in one group that we keep negotiating together. And the message is we need to make sure that when the leaders begin to arrive in Sharm el-Sheikh, we have a menu that would be presented to them that would really indicate our priorities. And I think the instructions we have given our teams is that we need to see nothing short of really concrete actions that would need to come out of the first African COP being held in the African soil. And so the instructions are very clear. But of course, it is those who are responsible most for climate change. It is really, we have to put more pressure, because it's an issue of justice, what we call climate justice, and also what we call just transition. Because now we are being asked, there are many countries, we have targets by 2030, we need to have eliminated use of fossil fuel. So those of us who have fossil fuel, like we have in Turkana, what will happen to that fossil fuel that we have, which we are not able to use? Those who have used it before have used to grow their economies. Now we are being asked to slow down. So we say we want to just transition, because yes, we recognize complaining to say, oh, we are not responsible, and continuing to use our fossil fuel is not in the best interest of us anyway. So, but we need a just transition where it's not abrupt. We need to find a way that is gradual, and we are supported. The way, for instance, South Africa, where somewhere in Glasgow, at least they managed to get about 8.5 billion to move away from coal. That kind of transition is important, that it should be just, so that economies don't feel the biggest impact. And we need hand-holding. Most of those countries, we need hand-holding, because we have also something called response measure. What happens to what you have forgotten? We have our coal, and we have abandoning it, because we have agreed as Kenya we need to show leadership. And we have actually shown that leadership through, for instance, in the energy sector, where now our electricity mix, we are 92% green. In other words, it's renewable energy. It's renewable energy.
And I like the fact that you've talked about the group of 77 plus China. And the fact of the matter is, China is one of the biggest emitters of green gas in the world. So in the group of 77, what kind of conversations are you having with China to try and reduce their emissions?
That conversation is not just about, of course, China is one of those we work together, and yes, there has been pressure from member countries, including Africa, for every emitter to take responsibility to reduce further emissions. And which is why a number of countries, including Kenya, chose to join the coalition of countries that seek to see greater reduction in fossil fuel. That is why in our national determined contribution, what we call NDC, we have identified 6 sectors to focus on mitigation, notwithstanding the fact that we are contributing less than 0.1% of greenhouse gas emission. But we want to take the little step to demonstrate that we are serious about matters climate change. So in energy, we have focused on, we are now 92% renewable. By 2028, 2030, we want to be 100% clean.
100% transition.
Yes, transition. In the transport sector, we have also joined the rest of the world to say, let's go electrical when it comes to motor vehicle. And whereas many countries took the ambition to go to have electric vehicles by 2030, we know our circumstances are different. So we chose a later period of around 2040. But we know that this government is also keen to move even faster. So maybe the target may even come back. Then we are talking about industries, manufacturing. That's another sector where we are saying we need to go circular. We need to now move from linear approach to circular approach, and make sure that in handling our industries, we have less emissions, and therefore a lot of things we have to do must be climate smart. We have also areas like agriculture, and even the area of waste. Waste is now an area we are saying we want to focus to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because we have a lot of organic matter, litter being thrown around. Most of these end up being part of greenhouse gas emission, which is why we have taken steps. We have a new policy on waste management. Parliament has helped us to pass a new legal framework on waste management that will transition Kenya now from linear to circular approach, which means we need to reduce waste, and with the waste that we have reduced, we need to recycle and reuse, so that all the time we have less and less waste, and therefore emissions. So that sector is another one that and then the last one, which is very important, is on land use change and forestry, or let's just call it forestry sector. We are saying that as part of adaptation and also dealing with mitigation, we want to raise our ambition on forest cover. And this government of President William Ruto has picked up from the previous government that had pushed the forest cover to 12%, to tree cover to 12%. Now we are saying that by 2032, the forest cover, the tree cover in Kenya will have to be 30%. Meaning we have to restore at least 10.6 million hectares of degraded land, which has been mapped. And this will require huge investments. We require also the same partners, and we are calling a lot of the countries that are already responsible for this. In the big countries, we are asking to support this initiative, because a 30% increase in a 30% tree cover is huge, given that Kenya is still 80% arid and semi-arid. So those are steps that demonstrate the leadership of Kenya, even when we know that we are contributing very little to climate change. So that is how to show leadership. We work together, but if everybody was to do the same, especially the developed countries, I think this world would be safer.
Very well. And I like the fact that you're quoting numbers. And I mean, it's a fact. Africa, contributes less than 4.5% of green gas emissions in the world. But when you look at the cost this is having to the African continent, and experts are saying that Africa will continue to lose about 4% of its GDP because of global warming all the way up to the year 2040. What do we need to do, as a continent? How do we speak with one voice to tell the world that, look here. I mean, yes, you're messing up, but we are paying the biggest price.
The estimates that I have seen show that for adaptation alone, Africa needs about $86.7 billion to deal with the climate change, to adapt to climate change. Mm-hmm. For us, under our NDC, we are saying for the next 10 years, we need $62 billion. For adaptation, we require $44 billion for 10 years. So in 1 year, $4.4 billion. So of the 86, you can see how much Kenya is going to use to adapt to climate change, $4.4 billion. Mm-hmm. This is money.
That is US dollars.
Yes.
So and we have more than 400 billion shillings.
Yes, and we are, 4 trillion.
4 trillion.
4 trillion. 4.4 trillion. It's almost 5 at the current exchange rate. Mm-hmm. So this is a lot of money. We don't have that money. When we made the commitments, we said we will spend around 21% of our budget, but the balance would come from our partners who are developed and who really want us to succeed in line with the spirit of the Paris Agreement. So we are depending on a number of our partners to support this cause, and we have actually made the call out there. And this is why we are really saying, please make good of your promise, because this is not something new. These are things which we have agreed, and all we need is to see greater goodwill, greater action for more money. If we get more financing, we have the will and the means to do it, because with the money, that would help us.
Has the world responded to our clarion call?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, when I look at the climate finance that is being availed to Africa, compared to total that's available, it's very small. I've seen around 3 to 5% of monies out there for climate change coming to Africa, which means it's still quite low. Mm-hmm. And this is why Africa is saying let's see more action. Because the scientists are telling us a 3% increase, 3 degrees increase in temperature for the world will be catastrophic for Africa. Because we are in the equator, a lot of us, it's warm, it's hot. So going to 3 degrees is going to be catastrophic. So and we are seeing and feeling this. So we are saying we need to see quick action on this. And therefore, while we are calling on our partners, we are also calling and telling ourselves as Africans that we need to take action ourselves, which means we need to do these actions that will help to mitigate and to adopt the climate change, like reforestation, which under what we call AFR 100, there was a target for 100 million hectares to be rehabilitated. For us, Kenya, we took a target of 5.1 billion hectares. Now we have doubled that in the new government, which says we want to target 10.6 million hectares to restore. When we restore our forests, the forest will act as carbon sinks. And these carbon sinks will also help in dealing with greenhouse gas emissions. Our forests are useful because they act also as water catchment. The biggest problem that we have now is the fact that we have less water. We are a water-stressed country. And because of that, we have human-wildlife conflict because our animals don't have enough water. Our people don't have also enough water. And this will be worsening. And so I tell Kenyans, we really don't need to join the bandwagon of just complaining that, oh, we are not responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. It is those who have the developed countries who should do it. No, we have a responsibility because we are feeling it now. So the call by our president that we should ask every Kenyan to plant at least 100 trees, for me, is achievable. I do, every time I go to tree planting, on average, within 1 hour, I can plant up to 50 trees. So if we purpose to do it even in a single day, I think a lot can be achieved. And so this is really what also I tell Kenyans, let's not see others responsible for our environment. We must be our stewards for the environment and recognize that climate change is real and therefore take every step on our way to mitigate, to help in mitigation and in adaptation of climate change.
When President Dr. William Ruto addressed the 77th edition of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, I mean, he made a passionate plea to the world leaders, that we need to recommit ourselves towards increasing green financing and, of course, cutting down on green emissions. But when you look at the club of the richest countries in the world, or the so-called G20, do you see commitments in these two areas?
I have seen some indication that there is an attempt by those countries to actually fulfill their pledge, at least on the 100 billion commitment. The latest numbers I've seen is that we are almost now around 80 billion. And but the latest science also indicate, and the estimates required, it means that we require even much more than 100 billion because the situation has worsened. And so they have to redouble their own commitments to ensure that we even have greater finance.
And this commitment they made in 2015?
Yes, 2015.
In France?
In France. Now in Glasgow, we also saw a lot of commitments. Even to the forest sector, there were quite a number of commitments. To the adaptation fund, we had lots of commitment. All we will be doing when we reach Sharm el-Sheikh is really to take stock of what has happened. Because since we left Glasgow, we are saying from Glasgow to Sharm el-Sheikh, which way have we gone? Have we seen increase in finance? I think this is what I'm getting, that there is likelihood. We have seen countries like USA, for instance, who had moved out of Paris Agreement, they have come back to Paris Agreement, and now have signed. They are now implementing the Paris Agreement, and therefore, with a country like US on the table, I think we've seen some traction. President Biden and his team have really come in, and I've seen traction coming from US, and that leadership from the US, being the biggest economy in the world, is really what the rest of the world is waiting for, and I think has been waiting for. And we see European countries are also demonstrating a lot of seriousness on this, and many other rich countries. So we expect more momentum, but all I say is we are in a crisis, and there is the time for more promises is no longer there. This issue is also, this problem is no longer only unique to Africa.
It's their globe.
You can see Pakistan. 1/3 of its country was ravaged by floods recently. We've seen Germany, a very developed country, also facing serious problems of shocks in terms coming from climate change. So this
even the United States.
Even the United States. So I think everyone now is impacted, and so there is a realization by all countries that we are in an emergency. So I think I am encouraged by what I see and the seriousness with which many countries are taking this.
Kenya, being the headquarters of the United Nations Environment Program, which really deals with issues around environment, and has a significant role to play in directing the rest of the world that this is the direction that we need to take on making our world sustainable. And I remember when President William Ruto met with the executive director of UNEP, Inga Anderson, he made it very clear that, as a country, we are willing to lead the world from the front. How do we expect to do this?
We are already leading from the front. First, with the decision in 1973 to accept UNEP as our headquarters, was a demonstration that Kenya is keen on matters environment. And indeed, Nairobi and Kenya at large is now an environmental capital for the world. And through UNEP, we have shown leadership. There's a lot right now we are working through UNEP to deal with the tri-planetary crisis. Remember, the problem is not just climate change. We also have biodiversity and nature loss. We have pollution. So in Nairobi, at least this year, we had the 5th session of the United Nations General Assembly, Environmental Assembly, and we were also celebrating UNEP at 50. And we have shown that leadership also going to Stockholm. When we worked, we partnered with at Stockholm, where we celebrated Stockholm at 50, and we went even to Portugal for the Ocean Conference. And so there has been demonstrated leadership on the part of Kenya, and even as we go to Sharm el-Sheikh, none other than our President William Ruto will lead us. And we are also, our President is also the chair of the Committee of Heads of State and Government on climate change under the AU. And so that is the leadership we're beginning to show. We have been taking that leadership across the world. And we have been lucky as a country because we have always been recognized as that one leader when it comes to matters environment and climate change. And we shall continue with that leadership. And so we want to strengthen UNEP. We want to see it more strengthened, and that any new agreements that come, including the one that we are talking about, the convention on the new agreement on plastics, its secretariat needs to be hosted in Nairobi, and any other that come, because we've seen also new institutions coming out of UNEP and going outside Nairobi. And we are saying, no, we want to concentrate and make and strengthen Nairobi. So we are doing everything possible to also make Nairobi a place where it's fit for purpose for an institution such as UNEP and the general UN family.
Very well.
Thank you
Well,
very
yes, thank you very much indeed for joining us and, of course, for sharing with us your insight. And we look forward to seeing you in COP27.
much. Thank you very much.
Very good. Well, climate change is an urgent matter that needs to be addressed not tomorrow, not yesterday, but today. That is a message from the PS in charge of environment and forestry, Dr. Chris Kipto. He has been our guest on this week's episode of Inside Government. My name is O'Brien Kimani. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.